On the banks of the Nile, more than 5,000 years ago, a people rose who would carve their name into the very stone of the earth. Their monuments still stand against the desert wind. Their gods still gaze from temple walls. Their stories still echo in the hearts of humankind. This was Egypt, not just a land but a world, where the line between heaven and earth blurred, where kings walked as gods, and where time itself seemed measured by the rhythm of the river's flood. To speak of Egypt is to speak of one of the longest stories ever told. For nearly 3,000 years, this civilization thrived, shaping the destiny of nations long after its fall. It is the land of the pyramids and the Sphinx, of hieroglyphs and temples, of pharaohs and peasants, of glory and ruin. And like every empire, its tale is not only about power gained, but also about power lost. Close your eyes and imagine. The desert stretches endless, but in its heart, a river glitters like a thread of life. Villages cling to its banks, fields bloom green where water spreads, and farmers bow in gratitude to the flood that feeds them. Across the horizon, a pyramid rises, its stones stacked higher than any building the world had seen. In the palace, the pharaoh sits beneath a canopy of gold. Priests chant to the gods, scribes scratch history into papyrus, and armies prepare to march to distant lands. This is Egypt at its dawn, full of promise, mystery, and majesty. But as we will see, even the greatest kingdoms carry seeds of weakness. The same monuments that display power can drain wealth. The same rulers who bring glory can fall to pride. The same unity that built pyramids can fracture into civil war. Egypt rose from the Nile's gift, but it also fell to greed, invasion, and the endless turning of time. Our journey in this story will not be a list of dates or rulers. It will be a tale, a flowing narrative of how Egypt began, how it flourished, how it reached peaks of brilliance, and how step by step it declined. We will meet kings and queens whose names echo even today. Nama, who first united the land. Khufu, whose pyramid still towers. Hatshepsut, the queen who wore the crown. Akhenaten, the heretic who worshipped one god. Tutankhamun, the boy king whose tomb still dazzles. Rameses, the great warrior who claimed immortality. And at the end, Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, whose fall marked the end of an age. But this story is not only of rulers. It is of the farmers who bent over fields, the craftsmen who carved statues, the scribes who kept knowledge alive, the soldiers who marched in sand, and the mothers who prayed for their children under the gaze of gods. Egypt's rise and fall is the story of a people as much as it is of their leaders. We will also ask questions. What made Egypt so strong for so long? What mistakes weakened it? Which leaders brought light and which brought ruin? And perhaps most intriguing of all, if Egypt still existed as a living empire today, with all its land and resources, what kind of power would it be in our modern world? To understand Egypt's greatness, we must start with its foundation, the Nile. Without the river, Egypt would not exist. Its floods brought life to the desert, and its rhythm gave Egypt stability unmatched in the ancient world. From this river came wealth, faith, and power. From this river came the confidence to build monuments for eternity. Yet the Nile also teaches us a lesson. It rises, it floods, it nourishes, but it also withdraws. It gives and it takes away. In many ways, the Nile is Egypt's own story, a cycle of rise and fall, of strength and weakness, of gift and loss. As we step into this journey together, imagine yourself walking through the great temples of Karnak, where columns rise like forests of stone. Imagine sailing down the Nile in a wooden boat, hearing the songs of boatmen as the sun glows red over the horizon. Imagine standing before the Great Pyramid of Giza, feeling its shadow stretch across the desert. Imagine the thrill, the mystery, the awe. This is not just history. This is civilization at its most human and its most divine. Egypt rose because it found unity where others found chaos. It fell because, like all empires, it could not escape time's weight. But its memory never died. To this day, children learn of pyramids, travelers stand in wonder before temples, and scholars still puzzle over hieroglyphs. Egypt lives in stone, in myth, and in the human imagination, and so we begin. This is the story of Egypt, how it built power, how it lost it, and how its shadow still stretches across our world. Long before pyramids rose and pharaohs carved their names into stone, Egypt was already blessed with its greatest treasure, the Nile. Stretching more than 4,000 miles from the heart of Africa to the Mediterranean Sea, the Nile was the thread that tied together the desert world. Without it, there would have been no Egypt. With it, a civilization unlike any other could grow and endure for thousands of years. Every year, the Nile performed its miracle. In summer, rains far to the south swelled the river, and its waters spilled over the banks into Egypt's fields. What might have been a disaster elsewhere was here a gift. When the waters receded, they left behind dark, fertile silt, rich soil that could grow wheat, barley, vegetables, and flax. In the middle of barren desert, this green belt of life stretched for miles on either side of the river. The Egyptians did not just live beside the Nile, they lived because of it. For the farmer, the rhythm of life was measured not by clocks, but by the river's rise and fall. Each year had 3 seasons: Akhet, the flooding season; Peret, the growing season; and Shimu, the harvest season. The farmer watched the water, waited for the fields to drink, planted seeds, and prayed for good harvests. Too little flood and famine struck. Too much flood and homes were washed away. The Nile gave life, but it also demanded respect. The river was more than food. It was also a road. Boats of papyrus and wood sailed up and down its current, carrying grain, stone, soldiers, and messages. While deserts cut Egypt off from enemies, the Nile connected its people. From the delta in the north to the cataracts in the south, the river tied Egypt into one long, narrow kingdom. A king in Memphis or Thebes could send orders quickly by boat, and traders could carry goods across hundreds of miles. This unity of geography gave Egypt a stability that few other lands enjoyed. Religion, too, grew from the river. Egyptians saw the Nile as a divine force, a gift from the gods. They believed Hapi, the Nile god, brought the floods. They saw Osiris, god of death and rebirth, reflected in the river's cycle of flood and retreat. Just as the Nile brought life after death of drought, so too could people find life after death in the underworld. To Egyptians, the river was a mirror of eternity. Villages sprang up along the Nile's banks, simple clusters of mud brick homes shaded by date palms. Cattle grazed nearby, fishermen cast nets into the water, and children played in the shallows. Each village was tied to the river's gift. Beyond the green strip of fields, the desert stretched empty and endless, a barrier that protected Egypt from invasion. This isolation gave the Egyptians confidence that their world was chosen, set apart, safe beneath the watch of their gods. But the Nile also brought challenges. The floods were not always predictable. In years when waters failed, famine came and families starved. In years of heavy floods, homes and fields were destroyed. Over time, Egyptians built canals, dikes, and reservoirs to manage the waters. This need for cooperation pushed people to organize, to plan, and to obey leaders who could manage the river's bounty. In many ways, the Nile not only fed Egypt, but also taught it discipline and unity. Trade moved along the river's path. From the south came gold, ivory, and exotic animals. From the north came timber, copper, and luxury goods. The Nile was Egypt's highway to wealth, its open door to the wider world. Markets bustled with traders, exchanging grain for precious goods, perfumes, and jewelry. The Nile carried wealth as easily as it carried water. In the quiet evenings, as the sun set in glowing red over the desert, families gathered by the river's edge. They sang songs, told stories of gods and kings, and watched the waters shimmer. The river was not just a resource, it was a presence, a companion in life and death. When Egyptians died, they hoped their souls would sail smoothly across the waters of the afterlife, just as they had sailed the Nile in life. Foreign travelers who visited Egypt marveled at the abundance of food, the richness of fields, and the majesty of temples rising from the river's edge. They knew at once that Egypt's strength lay in the Nile. Greek historian Herodotus, centuries later, would call Egypt the gift of the Nile. And he was right. Without it, there would be no Egypt. But the Nile also gave Egypt something less visible, yet more powerful: time. While other civilizations rose and fell quickly, torn by wars and invasions, Egypt's natural defenses, the deserts, the seas, and the cataracts, protected it. The Nile, steady and faithful, gave Egypt continuity. It allowed dynasties to rise, fall, and rise again. It allowed culture, language, and memory to survive for millennia. The river gave Egypt not just life, but eternity. As we move forward into the story of Egypt, we will see kings build pyramids, armies march to victory, priests guide the people, and invaders break through. Yet always, behind it all, the Nile flows. Its waters carried the greatness of Egypt, and when Egypt declined, it still flowed, reminding us that civilizations are but guests upon the river of time. The Nile was Egypt's blessing, but it also held a warning. Just as its floods could change from year to year, so too could fortune. Just as the river rose and fell, so too would Egypt. The story of Egypt's rise and fall begins here, with the river that made it possible. From the earliest days, Egypt was not one land, but two. In the south, along the narrow valley of the Upper Nile, stood the kingdom of Upper Egypt. In the north, where the river branched into its broad delta, lay Lower Egypt. Each had its own crown, its own traditions, and its own rulers. For centuries, these two lands looked upon each other with rivalry, sometimes trading, sometimes fighting. Yet in the course of time, they would become one, united under a single ruler, the first pharaoh. And from that union, the story of Egyptian kingship would begin. The memory of this moment lived in legend. The name most often given is Narmer, sometimes called Menes, who around 3100 BCE brought the two lands together. On a carved stone pallet found in Hierakonpolis, Narmer is shown wearing both the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, striking down his enemies with divine authority. Whether every detail is true or not, the symbol is clear. Egypt was now one. For the first time, the Nile Valley spoke with a single voice, ruled by a single king who was more than a man. The Egyptians did not see their rulers as ordinary kings. They saw them as the living embodiment of Horus, the falcon god, protector of the land. The pharaoh was the bridge between heaven and earth, chosen by the gods to maintain Ma'at, the divine order of truth, justice, and balance. Without the pharaoh, the world might sink into chaos. With him, the Nile would flood, the sun would rise, and the gods would be satisfied. To obey the king was to obey heaven itself. This idea gave Egypt stability. In Mesopotamia, kings rose and fell quickly, and city-states often fought each other. But in Egypt, the pharaoh stood as a single figure of unity. His crown was not just a symbol of power, but of divine harmony. The double crown, combining red and white, showed that Upper and Lower Egypt were no longer enemies, but two halves of a greater whole. The early dynasties set the foundation for Egypt's greatness. They established capitals, built temples, and organized the land. Canals were dug, fields measured, taxes collected, and records kept. Scribes, trained to master the sacred writing of hieroglyphs, began to record history, prayers, and decrees. Priests conducted rituals to honor the gods and to confirm the pharaoh's sacred role. Soldiers guarded borders and secured trade routes. For the first time, Egypt was more than villages along a river. It was a kingdom with order, faith, and purpose. Life under these early rulers was not only about obedience, it was about hope. To the farmer, the pharaoh's strength promised fertile floods and protection from raids. To the craftsman, it meant work building temples or carving statues. To the priest, it meant certainty that the gods were honored. The king's presence touched every corner of life, from the smallest hut to the grandest palace. The rise of kingship also created a new sense of time. Egyptians began to count years by the reign of their pharaohs. The year of the first census under the king. The year of the great festival. History itself was tied to the throne. Death did not end a pharaoh's role, for he became divine in the afterlife, joining the gods to watch over the land forever. His son would inherit the throne, continuing the cycle. In this way, kingship became eternal, stretching across generations. Ceremony and ritual reinforced the pharaoh's power. Festivals celebrated his divine role. Processions carried sacred images of gods through the streets, and the people cheered as their ruler appeared in shining robes. The said festival, held after 30 years of a king's rule, renewed his strength, presenting him as eternally young and powerful. Every gesture, every crown, every scepter carried meaning. Even the crook and flail he held symbolized care and discipline. Shepherd of his people, master of order. But behind the grandeur lay responsibility. To fail in Ma'at was to risk famine, invasion, or rebellion. A weak king could lose the loyalty of his people, and Egypt could fall into disorder. The very unity that gave Egypt strength could also fracture if kingship faltered. The story of Egypt's rise begins with its kings, but so too does the story of its eventual decline. For now, though, the dawn was bright. Narmer's unification gave Egypt the foundation to build monuments that would outlast time. It created a vision of leadership that held the land together for centuries. It gave the people confidence that their world was chosen, guided by gods, protected by kings. This belief in divine kingship would carry Egypt through its old kingdom, its middle kingdom, and its new kingdom. It would inspire builders, soldiers, priests, and poets. And it would give the pharaohs power greater than any other rulers of the ancient world. The Nile had given Egypt life, but kingship gave it direction. With a ruler on the throne, Egypt became not just a land, but a civilization. And as the first dynasties laid their foundations, the stage was set for the age of pyramids, temples, and glory that was soon to come. The story of Egypt's greatness cannot be told without pausing at the Old Kingdom, often called the Age of the Pyramids. It was during these centuries, from around 2700 to 2200 BCE, that Egypt rose from being a newly unified kingdom into one of the most dazzling civilizations the world had ever seen. It was here that stone was shaped into eternity, where pharaohs reached their peak of divine authority, and where the idea of a kingdom built on order and faith became carved into desert rock. When Narmer and the first kings unified Egypt, they laid a foundation, but it was in the Old Kingdom that this foundation grew into something monumental. Quite literally. The pharaoh was now not only a king, but also a god on earth, the living Horus, chosen to maintain Ma'at, the divine balance of truth and justice. To the people, he was the guarantee that the Nile would flood, that the sun would rise, that life itself would continue. And so they built for him not palaces of mud, but pyramids of stone, tombs meant to last forever, monuments that declared to the world and to eternity, here lies a god among men. The first great step came with Djoser, the pharaoh of the third dynasty. Under his reign, a man named Imhotep, priest, architect, and genius, designed something never seen before. At Saqqara, Imhotep raised the step pyramid, a massive stairway of stone that climbed toward the sky. Until then, Egyptian rulers had been buried in simple mastabas, rectangular tombs of mud brick. But Imhotep dared to stack mastabas on top of each other, layer upon layer, until a towering monument rose. It was both a tomb and a statement. Egypt was no longer building for years, but for eternity. The step pyramid dazzled the ancient world. Its vast courtyards, chapels, and underground chambers were carefully planned, lined with stone walls that have outlasted millennia. It was a revolution, not just in architecture, but in thinking. For the first time, humans built not for generations, but for forever. The desert became a stage for eternity, and Egypt took its place at the center. But the Egyptians were not content to stop there. Each pharaoh sought to outdo the one before, to build higher, stronger, more perfect. By the fourth dynasty, under Sneferu, pyramid building reached new heights. Sneferu experimented with shapes. The bent pyramid at Dashur, with its sudden change of angle, still rises awkwardly, a lesson in ambition. But Sneferu did not fail. He built also the Red Pyramid, smooth-sided and vast, the first true pyramid. His work set the stage for his son, Khufu, and Khufu would leave a legacy that has never been surpassed, the Great Pyramid of Giza. Standing nearly 150 meters tall, built from more than 2 million blocks of stone, each weighing several tons, the Great Pyramid was more than a tomb. It was a mountain of faith, power, and determination. For centuries, it stood as the tallest structure ever built by human hands. Even today, travelers stand before it in awe, wondering how such a feat was possible with simple tools, ropes, and human strength. The building of such monuments required an entire nation's effort. Farmers, when fields lay under floodwater, worked as laborers on the king's projects. Stone was cut from quarries, hauled on sleds, floated down the Nile, and dragged across desert sands. Teams of workers carved, lifted, and set blocks with precision. Scribes kept records, overseers gave orders, and priests blessed the work. It was not slaves who built these wonders, as later myths claimed, but ordinary Egyptians, offering their labor as a sacred duty, believing that in raising stone for their king, they were serving the gods themselves. Beside the Great Pyramid, smaller pyramids rose for queens, mastabas for nobles, and temples for rituals. The Giza Plateau became a city of the dead, carefully arranged to mirror the eternal order of heaven. To stand there was to feel that the pharaoh truly ruled not just Egypt, but time itself. Khufu's successors, Khafra and Menkaure, built their own pyramids at Giza, smaller but still grand. Khafra's pyramid was guarded by the Great Sphinx, its lion's body and human face staring endlessly across the sands. Whether the Sphinx was carved as Khafra's likeness or as a guardian spirit, it has become Egypt's most enduring symbol. Mysterious, silent, timeless. But pyramids were more than tombs. They were a theology in stone. Their shape, rising from earth to sky, mirrored the rays of the sun, guiding the soul of the pharaoh to join Ra, the sun god, in the heavens. Inside, chambers and passages were aligned with stars, linking the dead king with the eternal order of the cosmos. Each pyramid was a prayer in architecture, a belief carved into limestone that life did not end with death, that kingship was eternal, that Egypt was everlasting. The Old Kingdom was not only about pyramids, though they dominate the desert. It was also an age of centralized power when pharaohs held unmatched authority. From their palaces, they controlled land, trade, labor, and law. Nobles and officials served them, priests honored them, and peasants obeyed them. Egypt was not a loose collection of villages anymore. It was a machine of faith and labor, organized to keep the king as the pivot of the universe. Religion permeated everything. Temples were built not just for gods, but also for the pharaoh himself, who was worshipped as divine. Festivals celebrated the balance of Ma'at. Processions carried sacred images along the Nile, and offerings flowed daily to both gods and king. To live in Egypt was to live in a sacred order, where every act, from planting seeds to raising pyramids, was part of the eternal cycle of life, death, and rebirth. Yet even in this golden age, cracks appeared. Building pyramids of such size demanded enormous resources. Food had to be stored, labor managed, taxes collected. Over time, local governors gained more power as they oversaw these tasks. As the pharaoh's projects grew larger, so too did the strain on the land and people. And when weaker kings followed, unable to command the same authority, Egypt's unity began to tremble. The Old Kingdom eventually declined around 2200 BCE. Famines struck when the Nile's floods failed. Local nobles, called nomarchs, grew powerful and acted independently. Central power weakened, and Egypt entered a period of chaos known as the First Intermediate Period. The pyramids still stood, but the authority they symbolized had cracked. The age of great builders had passed, and Egypt faced a time of division and struggle. But the pyramids endured. Long after the kings who built them were forgotten, long after Egypt itself changed rulers and religions, the pyramids remained. They are not simply stones. They are voices from the Old Kingdom, whispering across the desert. We were here, we believed, we built for eternity. The Old Kingdom gave Egypt its greatest symbols and its deepest faith in eternity. It showed the heights of human ambition and the cost of greatness. It proved that a nation could organize itself for wonders, but also warned that overreach could bring decline. It was the first golden age, the age of pyramids, and its shadow still falls across Egypt today. Behind the towering pyramids, the temples, and the golden crowns of pharaohs, there lay another Egypt, the Egypt of ordinary people. It is easy to imagine Egypt only in terms of kings and monuments, but the truth is that its strength came from farmers, craftsmen, scribes, soldiers, and families who lived along the Nile. Their hands tilled the soil, carved the stone, wrote the records, and raised the children who carried traditions forward. Without their daily labor and their quiet devotion, no pyramid would have risen, no temple would have stood, and no pharaoh would have ruled. The life of a farmer was shaped by the Nile's rhythm. When the floods came in the season of Akhet, fields disappeared underwater, and families turned to other tasks, repairing tools, weaving baskets, or often joining the workforce on great building projects. When the waters receded in Pere, they planted seeds, pushing them into the moist earth by hand or with simple wooden plows pulled by oxen. In Shemu, the harvest season, families cut grain with sickles of sharpened flint and bundled stalks under the hot sun. Wheat and barley became bread and beer, the staple food and drink of Egypt. Without bread and beer, no feast could be held, no worker could endure long days, and no ritual could be complete. Life in the village was simple, but full of rhythm. Mud brick houses lined narrow lanes, roofs flat, and often used as sleeping places on hot nights. Inside, women ground grain on stone querns, baked bread in clay ovens, and brewed beer in jars. Children played in the dust, chasing each other, splashing in the Nile, or helping their parents herd goats and cattle. Families prayed to household gods, offering small figurines or food, asking for health, protection, and safe births. Craftsmen formed the backbone of Egypt's beauty. Skilled stone carvers shaped statues of gods and kings, their hands steady as they chiseled granite into faces of timeless calm. Potters spun clay into jars painted with simple patterns. Weavers made linen from flax, fine enough for the pharaoh's robes, or coarse enough for a farmer's tunic. Jewelers worked with gold from Nubia, inlaying it with bright stones like turquoise and lapis lazuli. These craftsmen lived modestly, but their work filled temples and palaces with splendor, and much of it has survived for thousands of years. Scribes were another pillar of society, though fewer in number. To read and write hieroglyphs was a rare skill, demanding years of training. Scribes kept records of harvests, taxes, laws, and rituals. They copied hymns, myths, and prayers. They served in temples, offices, and armies, their reed pens scratching ink onto papyrus scrolls. To become a scribe was to rise above manual labor, to enter a respected class. Many parents dreamed that their sons might become scribes, for a scribe does not sweat in the sun, as one old Egyptian saying went. Priests held great authority. They oversaw temples, performed rituals, and managed vast estates of land and wealth given to the gods. They were keepers of sacred knowledge, interpreting omens, guiding festivals, and ensuring that Ma'at, cosmic balance, was preserved. For the ordinary person, the temple was both a place of prayer and a place of power. Priests could bless marriages, heal sickness, or declare the will of the gods. They often rivaled the pharaoh in influence, and in later centuries, their power would even challenge kings themselves. Soldiers too played a role beyond war. They defended borders, guarded officials, and sometimes worked as laborers in peacetime. In the Old Kingdom, Egypt was relatively safe, but as time went on, armies became more professional. For many young men, joining the army meant steady food, a chance for adventure, and sometimes rewards of land. Family was the heart of Egyptian society. Marriage was practical but affectionate, and both men and women had rights. Women could own property, inherit wealth, and even divorce. Scenes on tomb walls show couples dining together, women tenderly holding their husbands, children standing proudly at their sides. While life was hard, the family bond offered comfort and purpose. Religion filled every corner of daily life. Ordinary people prayed to gods of fertility, harvest, and protection. Amulets of scarabs or eyes were worn to guard against evil. The afterlife was not just for kings. Common people also dreamed of living forever in the field of reeds, a paradise where crops grew tall and families reunited. Funerary practices varied by wealth, but even the poor buried their dead with small offerings, hoping to secure favor with the gods. Music, games, and festivals brought joy. Harps, flutes, and drums played at gatherings, while children rolled balls, played with dolls, or wrestled for fun. Festivals of the gods were celebrated with parades, feasting, and dancing. The Nile was not only work, but also leisure, its banks alive with laughter, songs, and fishing boats. Yet life was not without struggle. Famines, sickness, and accidents claimed many lives early. Average life expectancy was short, perhaps 30 or 40 years, though some lived longer. Diseases from water, insects, or poor hygiene spread easily. But Egyptians accepted life as a cycle, death as a passage, and faith as their anchor. Daily life also reflected hierarchy. At the top stood the pharaoh, then nobles, priests, and high officials. Below them were scribes, craftsmen, and traders. Farmers formed the majority, working the land, paying taxes in grain, and laboring on state projects. At the bottom were servants and laborers who worked for wealthier households. Yet unlike some ancient societies, Egypt had room for movement. A farmer's son could become a scribe, a soldier could earn land, a craftsman could gain patronage. The beauty of Egyptian society was in its balance. Every person had a role, and every role fit into the larger order of Ma'at. Pharaoh upheld the divine balance. Priests maintained rituals, scribes kept records, farmers fed the nation, craftsmen built its glory, and families carried its traditions. It was a world where ordinary people lived ordinary days, yet together, their efforts built one of the most extraordinary civilizations the world has ever seen. As we walk through the streets of a village or stand in the courtyards of a temple in imagination, we see that Egypt's greatness was not only in its kings and monuments, but also in its people. Their bread, their songs, their prayers, and their labor were the true foundation of the empire. And just as pyramids were built stone by stone, Egypt was built day by day, life by life, generation by generation. To understand the Egyptians, you must step into their temples, listen to their prayers, and look into their tombs. For them, religion was not a part of life. It was life itself. Every breath, every harvest, every sunrise was a gift from the gods. Every act, from planting a seed to raising a pyramid, was part of a sacred cycle. The Egyptians lived in a world filled with divine presence, where the boundary between earth and heaven was thin, and the afterlife was as real as the ground beneath their feet. Their gods were many, and each one carried a story. Ra, the sun god, sailed his golden boat across the sky each day and through the underworld each night, fighting darkness so that dawn would return. Osiris, once a king on earth, ruled the realm of the dead, offering life after death to those who lived with righteousness. Isis, his devoted wife, symbolized love, magic, and protection. Her wings spread wide over the living and the dead. Horus, the falcon-headed sun, embodied kingship, soaring over the land as the protector of pharaohs. Anubis, with the head of a jackal, guided souls through burial and judged the purity of hearts. To Egyptians, the gods were not distant myths, but companions in every season of life. Temples rose as the houses of these gods. Massive pylons led into courtyards where priests offered food, incense, and hymns. Statues of the gods, often hidden deep within sanctuaries, were washed, dressed, and fed daily as if they were living beings. The people might not always enter these sacred chambers, but they gathered outside, joining festivals where images of the gods were carried in processions, decorated with garlands and honored with music and feasting. Religion was not a silent practice. It was alive, vibrant, and woven into the very fabric of society. But perhaps the most striking part of Egyptian faith was its view of death. Where many cultures feared death as an end, Egyptians saw it as a beginning, the gateway to eternity. Life on earth was a short chapter, a preparation for the journey beyond. To live with Ma'at, the balance of truth and justice, was to prepare your soul for the trials of the afterlife. Death was not to be feared but respected, planned for, and embraced with hope. The process of death and burial reflected this belief. Bodies were carefully mummified, organs removed and preserved, wrapped in linen, and placed in decorated coffins. This was not vanity, but necessity. The body was the vessel for the soul, and to decay was to lose the chance of rebirth. Families gathered goods for the journey: food, clothing, amulets, tools, even toys for children. In tombs of the wealthy, walls were painted with scenes of banquets, hunting, music, and games, so that the dead could enjoy these pleasures forever in the afterlife. Central to this belief was the weighing of the heart. Egyptians believed that when a soul entered the Hall of Judgment, it stood before Osiris and a panel of gods. Anubis placed the heart of the deceased on a scale, balanced against the feather of Ma'at. If the heart was light, free of sin, the soul passed into the field of reeds, a paradise of green fields, clear waters, and eternal peace. If the heart was heavy with lies and injustice, it was devoured by Amit, a fearsome beast with the head of a crocodile, the body of a lion, and the hind of a hippopotamus. To be devoured was to suffer the true death, to cease to exist forever. For Egyptians, the highest fear was not pain, but non-existence. To help guide the dead, texts were written, spells, hymns, and prayers known as the Book of the Dead. These scrolls, buried with the deceased, contained instructions for navigating the dangers of the underworld, how to pass gates, appease gods and answer questions in the judgment hall. They were roadmaps to eternity, ensuring that the soul would not wander lost. Even ordinary people tried to include small versions of these texts or simple charms, hoping for protection. For pharaohs and nobles, tombs were built as gateways to eternity. The pyramids of the Old Kingdom, the rock-cut tombs of the Valley of the Kings in later ages, and the richly decorated chambers of queens and princes all carried this message. Death was not an end, but a transformation. The walls told stories of daily life, hunts, feasts, and offerings, all painted so that they might live again in the afterlife. Servant statues, called shabtis, were placed to work for the deceased in paradise. The tomb was a home, built not for the living, but for the eternal soul. Religion also shaped law, politics, and morality. Ma'at was not only divine truth, it was social order. Judges, scribes, and even pharaohs were bound by it. To lie, cheat, or oppress was not merely wrong, it was a crime against the balance of the universe. The pharaoh, as the son of Ra and the living Horus, was charged above all to maintain Ma'at, to keep the Nile flowing, the borders safe, and the people fed. His failure was not only political, but cosmic. Religion made every action sacred and every duty eternal. Festivals gave the people moments of joy and connection. The festival of Opet in Thebes, for example, brought statues of the gods from Karnak to Luxor in grand processions, carried on boats, cheered by crowds, celebrated with music, dance, and offerings. The people felt close to their gods, reminded that divinity was not hidden, but present in their land. For the ordinary Egyptian, such festivals were times of hope, renewal, and belonging. In the end, religion gave Egyptians their identity. It bound the farmer to the king, the priest to the peasant, the soldier to the scribe. It offered comfort in hardship, meaning in labor, and hope in death. It gave rise to the greatest monuments, inspired the finest art, and guided the longest continuity of culture in human history. When we look at Egypt today, we still see their faith in stone, pyramids rising against the sky, temples carved with gods, tombs painted with eternal feasts. These were not built for vanity, but for belief. The belief that life was sacred, that death was a doorway, and that eternity was real. Egypt endured because its people lived not only for today, but also for forever. Their religion was not a myth, but a way of life, and their afterlife was not a dream, but a destination. In their faith, they found strength, and in their hope, they built eternity. The Old Kingdom had given Egypt its pyramids and its first golden age. But even great ages fade. By around 2200 BCE, Egypt slipped into chaos. The Nile's floods failed, crops withered, famine spread, and local governors, once loyal servants of the pharaoh, acted as kings in their own provinces. Unity cracked, order crumbled, and Egypt entered what we now call the First Intermediate Period. It was a time of division, of hunger, of uncertainty. The pharaoh's divine power, once unshakable, seemed to falter. For more than a century, Egypt was broken, a land of many rulers, each claiming authority, none holding true command. And yet, Egypt did not vanish. Its people endured, planting when they could, praying to the gods, waiting for stability. Out of this hardship emerged a new strength, and in time, new leaders rose who would bind Egypt together again. Around 2050 BCE, Pharaoh Mentuhotep II of Thebes defeated rivals and reunited the two lands. With his reign began the Middle Kingdom, an era not of massive pyramids, but of resilience, balance, and expansion. If the Old Kingdom was about grandeur, the Middle Kingdom was about recovery. Pharaohs of the 11th and 12th dynasties learned from the chaos of the past. They knew that no king could rule without supporting the people, without managing resources wisely, without listening to the pulse of the land. Their power was still divine, but it was also practical. They strengthened the central government, curbed the independence of local governors, and rebuilt the confidence of the people in their rulers. One of the most remarkable pharaohs of this age was Senusret III. Tall, commanding, and often depicted with a face carved in stone, showing lines of age and burden, he embodied the seriousness of kingship. He was no distant god-king smiling in eternal calm. He was a warrior, a judge, and a leader who bore the weight of his people's survival. Under Senusret, Egypt's borders expanded south into Nubia. Fortresses were built along the Nile to guard against enemies and to control trade routes. For the first time, Egypt looked beyond its own valley with determination, seeking influence and resources far afield. Trade flourished. Caravans crossed deserts to bring cedar wood from Lebanon, silver from the Aegean, and incense from Punt, a mysterious land to the south, possibly in modern Eritrea or Somalia. Egyptian ships, powered by oars and wind, sailed down the Red Sea, their hulls heavy with exotic goods. Markets in Thebes and Memphis filled with treasures from distant lands. This flow of trade not only enriched Egypt but also broadened its world, connecting it to cultures across Africa and the Near East. The Middle Kingdom also brought new creativity in literature and art. While the Old Kingdom had celebrated the pharaoh's eternal power, the Middle Kingdom spoke more to the struggles of ordinary people and the wisdom of leaders. Stories such as the Tale of Sinuhe, told of a court official who fled Egypt after the king's death, lived abroad, and longed to return home. His story captured both the vulnerability of individuals and the pull of Egypt as a homeland. Wisdom texts, teaching morality, justice, and humility, were copied by scribes, guiding generations in the values of Ma'at. In tombs and temples, art showed not only kings, but also farmers, animals, and daily life with greater realism. It was as if Egypt, humbled by crisis, now saw more clearly the humanity of its own people. Religion, too, shifted. While Pharaoh remained the guardian of Ma'at, the afterlife became more accessible to ordinary Egyptians. In the Old Kingdom, eternal life seemed reserved for kings and elites. But by the Middle Kingdom, even farmers could hope to join Osiris in the field of reeds, provided they lived justly and prepared their tombs with care. Coffin texts, spells and prayers written on the insides of coffins, replaced the Grand Pyramid texts, spreading the promise of eternity to more of society. Religion became more personal, more democratic, as if Egypt's hardships had opened the gates of heaven to all. But the Middle Kingdom was not only about recovery at home, it was also about expansion abroad. Campaigns into Nubia secured gold mines, vital for Egypt's wealth. Expeditions to Sinai brought copper and turquoise. Trade with the Near East brought new goods and ideas. Egypt was no longer just a self-contained river kingdom. It was becoming a regional power, stretching its influence far beyond the Nile. This was both strength and temptation, for expansion would always bring risk and cost. Yet for a time, balance held. Fields were fertile, temples active, and towns busy. Pharaohs built canals to improve irrigation, strengthened fortresses, and commissioned temples to honor the gods. They were remembered not just as builders of stone, but as stewards of prosperity. The Middle Kingdom became a model of what wise leadership could achieve. Order after chaos, unity after division, hope after despair. Still, cracks remained. The same challenges that had broken the Old Kingdom lingered. The Nile's unpredictability, the ambitions of local elites, the constant demand for resources. As time passed, weaker pharaohs followed stronger ones, and Egypt's grip loosened. By around 1700 BCE, foreign peoples known as the Hyksos entered the Nile Delta. With superior weapons, including horse-drawn chariots unknown to Egypt, they seized control of the north. For the first time in centuries, Egyptians were ruled by outsiders. The Middle Kingdom ended, and Egypt once more fell into division. Yet its legacy endured. It showed that Egypt could recover from collapse, that unity could be restored, that strength could return. It proved that greatness was not only about building pyramids, but also about wise governance, resilient people, and the ability to adapt. When we look back, the Middle Kingdom shines not with the blinding glory of the Old Kingdom, but with the steady light of resilience. It was Egypt at its most human, a civilization humbled, learning from failure, expanding its world, and preparing for the greatness and the struggles still to come. Egypt had endured famine, collapse, and even the humiliation of foreign rule under the Hyksos. But Egypt was not finished. Out of the struggle came renewal. Around 1550 BCE, Theban kings of the 17th dynasty rose in rebellion. They learned the ways of their conquerors, mastering the horse-drawn chariot and the new bronze weapons, and turned them back upon the invaders. By the time Pharaoh Amose drove the Hyksos from the delta, Egypt was not only free, but reborn. With his victory began the new kingdom, an age of glory, wealth and expansion, the true peak of Egyptian civilization. The New Kingdom, spanning the 18th to the 20th dynasties, was Egypt's golden empire. No longer content to rule only the Nile Valley, the pharaohs looked outward, sending armies into Nubia, Syria, and Palestine, extending their reach across the Near East. Egypt became a superpower, rivaling the Hittites and Mitanni, feared for its chariots, its disciplined soldiers, and its wealth. Temples grew taller, palaces richer, and pharaohs carved their names into history with wars, monuments, and dreams of immortality. One of the earliest and most remarkable rulers of this age was Hatshepsut, a woman who took the throne in a man's world. Officially, a regent for her young stepson, Thutmose III, she declared herself pharaoh, donning the false beard of kingship and ruling with wisdom and ambition. Her reign was marked not by endless wars, but by trade, prosperity, and monumental building. She sent expeditions to Punt, bringing back gold, incense, and exotic treasures. At Deir el-Bahari, her mortuary temple rose in terraces against the cliffs, a masterpiece of harmony between human design and natural rock. Hatshepsut showed that power could take many forms, and her memory, though later defaced by her successors, still endures in stone. Her stepson, Thutmose III, carried Egypt to its greatest military heights. Often called the Napoleon of Egypt, he led campaigns deep into the Levant, capturing cities and expanding Egypt's influence as far as the Euphrates River. His armies returned with tribute, gold, cattle, slaves, and exotic goods. Under his command, Egypt became not just a kingdom but an empire, with vassal states sending gifts and pledges of loyalty. For the first time, Egypt's power extended far beyond its natural borders, and pharaohs were no longer merely rulers of the Nile, but of vast territories. Yet not all pharaohs followed the same path. Akhenaten, once called Amenhotep IV, shocked Egypt by breaking with centuries of tradition. He abandoned the worship of many gods, elevating Aten, the sun disk, as the one true deity. He built a new capital, Akhetaten, dedicated to Aten, and composed hymns praising the sun's life-giving light. His art broke with convention, showing him and his queen, Nefertiti, in tender family scenes, playing with their daughters beneath the rays of Aten. But his religious revolution unsettled Egypt. Priests of Amun, once powerful, were pushed aside, and the people struggled to understand a faith that denied their ancient gods. After his death, his reforms collapsed, his city abandoned, his name erased by successors. Akhenaten's bold vision was a moment of change, but also a warning of how fragile even Pharaoh's authority could be when it challenged tradition. The boy king Tutankhamun, who followed, lived only briefly but became immortal in our own time. His tomb, discovered in 1922 almost intact, dazzled the modern world with golden treasures, chariots, statues, and the famous Mask of Gold. In life, he was a minor pharaoh, dying at perhaps 18, but in death, he became a symbol of Egypt's splendor. His treasures remind us that even the lesser kings of this age lived surrounded by unimaginable wealth, their tombs filled with riches meant to carry them into eternity. The New Kingdom also gave us Ramesses II, often called Ramesses the Great. His reign, lasting more than 60 years, was a time of monumental ambition. He led armies against the Hittites, clashing at the famous Battle of Kadesh, one of the earliest battles recorded in detail. Though the outcome was indecisive, Ramesses declared victory and later signed the world's first known peace treaty. At home, he filled Egypt with monuments to his name, temples at Abu Simbel, carved into cliffs, with colossal statues of himself staring across the Nile, proclaimed his greatness. Cities bore his name, temples were inscribed with his deeds, and he sought to be remembered as Egypt's most glorious king. His ambition gave Egypt both pride and strain, for such projects demanded enormous resources. In these centuries, art and architecture flourished. The temples of Karnak and Luxor grew into vast complexes, filled with towering columns carved with hieroglyphs. Statues of pharaohs lined processional avenues, obelisks pierced the sky, and walls glowed with scenes of battles, offerings, and festivals. The Valley of the Kings became the resting place of pharaohs, with tombs carved deep into rock, walls painted with vivid images of the journey through the underworld. The Egyptians no longer built giant pyramids, but instead created hidden tombs, hoping to protect their treasures from tomb robbers. Ironically, almost all were looted, but the art that remains shows their vision of eternity with unmatched beauty. The people too shared in the prosperity. Farmers supplied grain not only for Egypt, but for trade abroad. Craftsmen of Deir el-Medina built tombs with unmatched skill, leaving behind not only masterpieces, but also records of their daily lives, strikes, and disputes. Soldiers marched with pride, priests performed grand festivals, and foreign tribute poured into the treasury. Egypt in the New Kingdom was not only powerful but also cosmopolitan, connected to a wider world of diplomacy, trade, and culture. Letters found in Amarna reveal pharaohs writing to kings of Babylon, Hatti, and Assyria, exchanging gifts and brides, negotiating alliances, and boasting of wealth. Egypt was part of an international age, standing proudly as one of its greatest powers. Yet even at its peak, the seeds of decline were sown. The vast empire required constant war to maintain. Tribute from vassals was never secure. Rebellions simmered, and enemies grew stronger. The priests of Amun, enriched by Pharaoh's offerings, became powerful in their own right, sometimes rivaling the king. Monumental projects drained resources, and the gap between rich and poor widened. Still, for several centuries, the New Kingdom shone as Egypt's brightest star. Its pharaohs were remembered for glory, its temples for beauty, its armies for might. To walk through Thebes in this age would be to see processions of priests, columns painted in gold and blue, soldiers returning with spoils, and the pharaoh himself presented as a god on earth. It was Egypt at its most confident, its most ambitious, its most alive. The Old Kingdom gave pyramids, the Middle Kingdom gave wisdom, but the New Kingdom gave empire. It was the height of Egyptian civilization, a time when the Nile's gift, the pharaoh's ambition, and the people's labor combined to create one of history's greatest ages. But history's law is unbending. What rises must one day fall, and though the New Kingdom seemed eternal, cracks would soon appear, leading Egypt from its brightest glory into the shadows of decline. The greatness of Egypt was not only written in its wars and its pharaohs, it was written in stone, in carvings, in colors that still shine after thousands of years. Egypt built for eternity. The builders of glory, architects, craftsmen, laborers, and dreamers left behind works that have become some of the most enduring symbols of human civilization. When we think of Egypt, we see the pyramids, the temples, the obelisks. These were not only monuments to power, but bridges between earth and heaven, between human hands and divine will. The New Kingdom, more than any other era, was the age of builders. Pharaohs poured wealth and resources into temples, shrines, and tombs. They no longer raised giant pyramids, but they carved into mountains, lifted colossal statues, and filled cities with monuments meant to inspire awe. Each pharaoh wanted to leave a mark, to proclaim his glory, to please the gods, and to secure his memory for eternity. Thebes, the capital of this age, became a city of wonders. At Karnak, the Temple of Amun grew into one of the largest religious complexes the world has ever known. Its hypostyle hall, with 134 columns soaring high, each carved and painted, created a forest of stone. Walking through it was like stepping into another world, where sunlight streamed through carved capitals and colors glowed on sacred walls. Priests processed through these halls. Pharaohs offered sacrifices, and the people gathered in festivals, watching their gods carried in golden boats along avenues lined with sphinxes. The temple was not just a place of worship. It was a symbol of Egypt's cosmic order, a reminder that the gods blessed their land. Luxor Temple, connected to Karnak by a long avenue of sphinxes, stood as another jewel. Built by Amenhotep III, and later completed by Ramesses II, it was a place of festivals, where statues of gods were brought in celebration. Its massive statues, obelisks, and courtyards glowed in the desert light. Together, Karnak and Luxor formed a sacred landscape, where heaven touched earth, and where pharaohs inscribed their devotion for eternity. The Valley of the Kings became the resting place of pharaohs. Instead of pyramids that drew the eyes of robbers, they chose hidden tombs carved into cliffs. Inside, walls were painted with vivid images: the sun's nightly journey through the underworld, the gods welcoming the king, the spells to guide his soul, tombs stretched deep into rock, chambers filled with treasures meant to serve the pharaoh forever. Craftsmen of Deir el-Medina, a village of builders and artists, worked for generations to carve and paint these eternal houses. Their hands created wonders like the tomb of Seti I, with corridors painted in brilliant blues and golds, or the small but famous tomb of Tutankhamun, packed with golden riches. These workers, though humble in life, left behind some of the greatest art in history. Beyond Thebes, pharaohs built temples across the land. Ramesses II raised Abu Simbel in Nubia, its colossal statues carved directly into cliffs, gazing out over the Nile. Twice a year, the sun's rays reached deep inside, illuminating the inner sanctuary, a sign of cosmic harmony. Other pharaohs left obelisks, tall spires of granite, carved from a single piece of stone, their tips gilded to shine with sunlight. These obelisks pointed to the heavens, symbols of eternal life and Pharaoh's connection to the gods. Many still stand, though far from Egypt, carried off to Rome, Paris, London, and New York in later centuries, silent witnesses to Egypt's ancient glory. But building was not only for kings and gods. Wealthy nobles built tombs decorated with scenes of their daily lives, banquets, hunts, farms, and music. They wanted eternity to reflect the joys of life. Even ordinary Egyptians shaped small shrines in their homes, painted simple prayers on walls, or placed offerings at village temples. Building was part of the culture itself, an expression of devotion, pride, and hope. The scale of these projects required immense organization. Farmers, when the Nile flooded and fields lay underwater, were drafted to work on temples and tombs. Stone was quarried from distant deserts, transported on sledges and boats. Architects designed plans, overseers commanded laborers, and scribes recorded supplies and rations. The state fed and housed thousands of workers, creating entire communities of builders. For them, the work was hard, but it was also sacred. To carve the name of Pharaoh into stone was to carve his place in eternity, and their own names sometimes appear in graffiti left behind, showing pride in their craft. Yet this golden age of building carried costs. Temples consumed wealth, armies consumed resources, and the burden fell upon the people. The grandeur of pharaohs was sustained by the grain harvested in villages, by the sweat of laborers, by the gold mined in Nubia. Building for glory always walked a line between devotion and excess. Still, Egyptians believed it was worth it, for these works tied them to the gods and promised eternity, and eternity has come in its own way. The pyramids, temples, and tombs still stand, weathered but unbroken. The art still glows with color. The hieroglyphs still speak across millennia. When we look upon Karnak's columns or Abu Simbel's statues, we are looking at the builder's dream, a dream of permanence, of glory that would never fade. In their faith, they believed that as long as their names were remembered, they would live forever. And in truth, they do. Egypt's builders were not only creating homes for gods or tombs for kings. They were creating memory itself, shaping how the future would see them. They succeeded beyond measure, for even now, thousands of years later, the world still marvels at what they left behind. These were the builders of glory, and their work remains one of humanity's greatest testaments to imagination, devotion, and endurance. To the Egyptians, the pharaoh was not simply a king. He was the link between heaven and earth, the living embodiment of Horus, the son of Ra, the maintainer of Ma'at, the divine balance that kept the universe in order. His presence was not only political, but cosmic. When the Nile flooded as expected, when crops grew tall, when enemies were defeated, the people believed it was because Pharaoh upheld harmony between the gods and humankind. His crown was not just a symbol of power, but a mark of sacred responsibility. From the earliest dynasties, pharaohs presented themselves as gods in flesh. They were depicted larger than life, their bodies perfect, their faces serene. On temple walls, they were shown smiting enemies, offering sacrifices, standing beside deities as equals. They were not merely rulers, They were chosen by the gods, sustained by divine favor, and destined to live forever. For the farmer in the field, the soldier in the ranks, or the scribe in the temple, the pharaoh's existence gave meaning to their own. He was their protector, their judge, their bridge to eternity. Yet pharaohs were also human, and behind the mask of divinity lay men with ambitions, fears, and flaws. Some embraced the role of god-king with vision and discipline. Others squandered it in vanity or weakness. The story of Egypt is shaped as much by these differences in leadership as by the flow of the Nile itself. Take Thutmose III, the warrior pharaoh. He embodied the image of strength, commanding armies across deserts and mountains, bringing tribute and conquest back to Egypt. His authority inspired loyalty, and his victories reassured his people that the gods favored him. Contrast him with Akhenaten, who turned away from Egypt's traditions, focusing on his vision of Aten while neglecting political realities. His religious zeal left Egypt vulnerable, and after his death, his reforms collapsed. Both were pharaohs, both believed themselves divine, but their choices carved different paths for Egypt. Rameses II pushed the idea of Pharaoh's divinity to new heights. His temples, his colossal statues, his inscriptions all declared him the chosen of the gods, almost their equal. At Abu Simbel, his towering images faced the sunrise, as if he himself commanded the dawn. His reign gave Egypt confidence, but it also revealed the tension between divine presentation and human reality. His campaigns, while glorified in stone, were not always the victories he claimed. His ambition strained resources. His divinity, carefully crafted, was both a source of stability and a mask hiding human limits. For the people, however, the pharaoh's image was enough. Most Egyptians never met their king, but they saw his statues, his temples, his name carved into walls. They watched festivals where his presence, carried on golden boats, appeared as part of divine rituals. They believed his words, chiseled in hieroglyphs, were eternal truths. To doubt Pharaoh was to doubt the gods, and to doubt the gods was to threaten Mayat itself. Yet even within Egypt, pharaohs had to balance divinity with governance. They appointed viziers to oversee justice, generals to lead armies, priests to maintain temples. They had to ensure food supplies, manage taxes, and protect borders. The illusion of godhood was sustained only if the reality of rule was effective. A weak pharaoh, unable to feed his people or defend his land, quickly lost the aura of divinity. And once faith in Pharaoh faltered, rebellion was never far. This delicate balance shaped Egypt's destiny. The best pharaohs understood that divinity was not only a claim, but a duty. They performed rituals daily, offering sacrifices to maintain harmony. They built temples not only to glorify themselves, but to reassure their people that the gods walked among them. They led armies when needed, judged disputes fairly, and rewarded loyalty. Such rulers sustained Egypt's greatness for centuries, but those who forgot this balance left Egypt vulnerable. Pharaohs who demanded endless monuments drained resources. Those who let priests grow too powerful lost control. Those who neglected diplomacy saw enemies rise. Divinity protected Pharaoh only as long as his actions upheld Ma'at. The gods were not fooled by appearances, nor, eventually, were the people. Over time, the relationship between Pharaoh and priests grew more complex. As temples gained wealth, priests of Amun became almost as powerful as kings. They controlled land, labor, and treasure. In later dynasties, they sometimes rivaled Pharaoh himself, reducing his divine aura to mere ceremony. The image of Pharaoh as god remained carved in stone, but the reality of power shifted, showing that even divinity could fade when human systems changed. And yet, across 3,000 years, the image endured. Pharaoh remained the axis of Egyptian life, the eternal figure linking heaven and earth. Even when Egypt was divided, invaded, or weakened, the idea of Pharaoh never vanished. It was too deeply woven into Egypt's soul, too central to its sense of identity. To be Egyptian was to be under Pharaoh's protection, to live in his shadow, to see his name as eternal. Today, when we stand before colossal statues, we still feel the power of this illusion. The serene faces, the perfect forms, the towering heights all whisper the same message. Pharaoh was not a man, but a god. And though history reminds us that pharaohs were mortal, their dream of eternity succeeded. Their images, carved in stone, still command awe. Their names, chiseled in hieroglyphs, still echo. Their vision of kingship as divine leadership remains one of history's most enduring legacies. Egypt's greatness did not rest on its Nile Valley alone. A kingdom that wished to thrive could not stay isolated. Though the river gave it food and the deserts gave it protection, Egypt's power in the New Kingdom and beyond came from looking outward, forging alliances, controlling trade, and managing the delicate balance of friendship and rivalry with neighbors near and far. Diplomacy and commerce were as much weapons as chariots and swords, and Egypt wielded them with skill. The Amarna letters, clay tablets discovered in the ruins of Akhetaten, open a window into this world of diplomacy. Written in cuneiform, the international language of the time, these letters record the voices of kings from Babylon, Hatti, Assyria, and beyond. They speak to Pharaoh not as a god, but as an equal, calling him my brother, offering daughters in marriage, asking for gold, complaining of late shipments. Here, Egypt is not only a kingdom of stone temples, but a player in a global network, trading brides, treasures, and words as powerful as armies. Gold was Egypt's greatest asset in diplomacy. From the mines of Nubia flowed a stream of precious metal unmatched by any other land. Foreign kings wrote repeatedly, begging Pharaoh for gold to adorn their temples, to pay their soldiers, to show their wealth. For Egypt, gold was not only currency but leverage. To give or withhold it was to make friends or enemies. Pharaoh's gold made him desirable as an ally and dangerous as a rival. Trade routes stretched far in every direction. From Lebanon came cedar wood, strong and fragrant, prized for ships and temples. From Sinai came turquoise and copper, mined at great effort. From the Levant and Mesopotamia came silver, wine, and olive oil. From Africa to the south came ebony, ivory, leopard skins, and incense, the treasures of Punt, reached by daring voyages down the Red Sea. Egyptian ships, their sails catching desert winds, returned heavy with foreign goods, bringing new scents, new colors, new luxuries into the Nile Valley. Caravans also crossed deserts, laden with goods. Donkeys carried grain, beads, and pottery across the sands to distant oases, where they were exchanged for salt, dates, and livestock. These routes were dangerous, vulnerable to raids, but they tied Egypt to a wider world. Every journey widened horizons, every trade brought wealth. The bustling markets of Memphis, Thebes, and Pi-Ramesses reflected Egypt's cosmopolitan nature, where foreign merchants mingled with locals, their tongues blending into a symphony of trade. Diplomacy also involved marriage. Pharaohs often took foreign princesses as wives, cementing alliances with neighboring kingdoms. These unions were more than personal. They were political symbols, living contracts between empires. A daughter of Babylon or Hatti in Pharaoh's harem meant peace, trade, and cooperation. But pharaohs were proud. They rarely gave their own daughters in return, keeping Egypt's royal bloodline tightly guarded. This imbalance sometimes caused tension, as foreign kings grumbled that Pharaoh asked for brides, but sent none. Yet still they complied, for to be allied with Egypt was to share in its glory. War and diplomacy often danced together. The Battle of Kadesh between Rameses II and the Hittites showed the limits of conquest. After years of struggle, both sides grew weary. Instead of endless war, they turned to words, signing the world's first recorded peace treaty. Carved into stone in both Egypt and Hatti, the treaty pledged eternal friendship, mutual defense, and alliance. It was a recognition that power was shared, that even great kings needed peace as much as victory. Egypt's diplomacy was not only with great empires, but also with smaller states. Vassal kings in Canaan and Syria sent tribute, letters, and desperate pleas for military aid. They swore loyalty to Pharaoh, but often balanced it with secret ties to rival powers. Managing these relationships required constant vigilance, for loyalty could shift as quickly as the wind. Egypt's armies ensured compliance when needed, but its gold and gifts often did the work more subtly. Foreigners were not only allies or enemies, many became part of Egypt itself. Nubians served as soldiers and policemen, prized for their skill with bows. Asiatic traders settled in the delta, bringing their gods and customs. Some rose to high office, becoming trusted officials. Egypt absorbed influences even as it projected its own culture outward. In art, language, and religion, traces of foreign lands blended with Egyptian traditions, enriching the civilization while also reminding it of its porous boundaries. Yet Egypt's wealth also made it a target. Sea peoples, mysterious raiders from across the Mediterranean, attacked its coasts during the late New Kingdom. Their fleets threatened Egypt's ports and villages. Their warriors sought plunder. Ramesses III fought them off, recording his victories on temple walls, but the cost was great. These invasions revealed that Egypt's network of trade and diplomacy could also bring danger, tying it to a world that was increasingly unstable. Still, for centuries, Egypt thrived through its outward gaze. Its diplomacy showed sophistication, its trade brought wealth, and its foreign relations revealed a kingdom both proud and pragmatic. Egypt's rulers understood that power was not only measured in armies but also in alliances, not only in conquests, but also in conversations written on clay and sealed in stone. The story of Egyptian diplomacy teaches us that even the mightiest empire cannot stand alone. Strength is found not only in the sword, but in the hand extended in friendship, not only in wealth hoarded, but in wealth shared. Egypt mastered this art, and for generations it kept the balance of power in its favor. But as the world beyond Egypt grew more turbulent, and as its own leaders became less capable, the delicate web of trade and alliances would fray. What had once been Egypt's strength would, in time, reveal its vulnerabilities. For centuries, Egypt had been the fortress of the Nile, a kingdom shielded by deserts and seas, guarded by its gods, confident in its eternal order. But no wall lasts forever, and no kingdom can remain untouched by the storms beyond its borders. As Egypt reached its height of power in the new kingdom, its enemies grew sharper, stronger, and closer. The age of secure isolation was over. The gates of Egypt were tested again and again, and each test revealed both the strength and the fragility of its empire. To the south lay Nubia, long both friend and rival. Nubians had been traders, soldiers, and allies, their lands rich in gold and resources. Egypt had expanded into Nubia during the Middle and New Kingdoms, building fortresses and temples to secure control. Yet the south was never quiet. Rebellions rose, and though Egypt usually crushed them, it became clear that Nubia was not merely a colony, but a proud neighbor waiting for its chance to assert independence. Nubian archers, skilled and feared, served in Egyptian armies, but they also reminded Pharaoh that loyalty could shift with time. In centuries to come, Nubians would not only resist Egypt but rule it, turning the old balance upside down. To the east and northeast lay greater threats. The Levant, rich in cities and crossroads of trade, was the stage where Egypt faced constant challenge. When Thutmose III expanded Egypt's empire, he subdued the cities of Canaan and Syria. They sent tribute, bowed to Pharaoh, and filled his treasuries. But tribute was fragile. Behind their walls, these cities nursed resentment, waiting for moments of weakness. Rivals like the Hittites of Anatolia saw Egypt's possessions as prizes, and clashes became inevitable. The Battle of Kadesh, fought around 1274 BCE between Ramesses II and the Hittite king Muwatalli II, showed how high the stakes had risen. Egypt's chariots thundered across the plains, its soldiers fought bravely, and Ramesses declared victory in carved inscriptions. Yet in truth, the battle was indecisive, with both sides claiming success. Kadesh remained contested, and the conflict showed that Egypt could no longer dominate the Near East as it once had. For the first time, Egypt faced a rival of equal strength, and the image of Pharaoh as invincible began to crack. Beyond the Hittites came new dangers. The Sea Peoples, these mysterious groups, possibly displaced by upheavals in the Mediterranean, swept across the region with ships and armies. They struck at cities, toppled kingdoms, and burned fields. By the time they reached Egypt in the reign of Ramesses III, much of the eastern Mediterranean lay in ruins. The reliefs of Medinet Habu, his mortuary temple, depict the desperate struggle. Egyptian archers firing from ships, enemies in strange feathered helmets storming the shores, women and children carried in ox-drawn carts, a people on the move. Ramesses III claimed victory, and Egypt survived, but the cost was immense. The Sea Peoples had destroyed kingdoms older than Egypt itself, and though Egypt stood, it was weakened, drained of resources, and forced onto the defensive. The Libyans to the west also pressed against Egypt's borders. For centuries, nomadic tribes had lived in the deserts beyond the Nile's fertile strip, sometimes raiding, sometimes trading. But as Egypt grew weaker, Libyan groups pressed harder, moving into the delta, challenging Egyptian control. In later centuries, Libyan chiefs would rise to power inside Egypt itself, ruling as pharaohs. What had once been minor border skirmishes became threats to the very heart of the kingdom. Inside Egypt, these external pressures revealed cracks. Temples demanded more wealth, armies grew more expensive, and common people bore the weight of taxes and labor. Pharaohs who could once boast of victories now struggled to hold ground. The divine image of the god-king clashed with the reality of defeats and compromises. To claim victory when none was won kept up appearances but eroded trust. Egypt's enemies were not only at its gates, they were inside its spirit, gnawing at its confidence. Diplomacy, once a tool of strength, became harder to wield. As Egypt gave more gold to buy loyalty, its treasuries grew thinner. As rivals grew stronger, Pharaoh's promises sounded less convincing. Vassal states in Canaan turned to other powers. Alliances frayed, and the reach of Egypt's influence shrank. The empire built on conquest and tribute began to slip away, piece by piece, as enemies pressed harder at every frontier. And yet, even in this age of pressure, Egypt endured. Its walls did not fall in a single night, nor its temples in a single season. Pharaohs still stood tall, armies still marched, priests still offered prayers. But each battle, each invasion, each raid chipped away at the old certainty that Egypt was eternal. The Nile still flowed, but the world beyond its banks had changed. Egypt could no longer stand apart. It was part of a stormy, unstable world. When we think of Egypt's decline, we must remember that it was not weakness alone, but pressure from without as much as within. Enemies at the gates did not merely batter walls. They tested the system, the faith, and the unity of Egypt itself. For a time, Egypt held firm, but the cracks spread. And as history teaches us, the cracks at the edges often reach the center. Empires do not collapse from outside blows alone. More often, they weaken from within, long before enemies arrive at their borders. Egypt, so mighty for so many centuries, was no exception. While chariots clashed at Kadesh and foreign ships raided its coasts, the deeper threats came from Egypt's own soil. Corruption, division, economic strain, and the slow erosion of faith in Pharaoh's power. The cracks that had begun at the edges of the empire widened into the heart of the kingdom. The most pressing issue was the weight of wealth. Pharaohs of the new kingdom had built enormous temples, funded endless wars, and filled their tombs with treasures. Such grandeur demanded resources: grain from farmers, gold from Nubia, labor from villagers, taxes from all. At first, the Nile's bounty seemed endless, but in time, the strain became too much. Harvests failed in some years. Floods were unpredictable, and when famine struck, the people bore it with less patience than before. Temples, however, never shrank in appetite. Priests of Amun, in particular, amassed vast estates, controlling lands, slaves, and treasure on a scale that rivaled Pharaoh himself. This imbalance tilted Egypt's power. The pharaoh was still the divine ruler in theory, but in practice, priests commanded wealth, local officials ran provinces, and generals controlled soldiers. The unity of Pharaoh's command, so strong in earlier centuries, dissolved into competing powers. In Thebes, priests of Amun grew so influential that they were kings in all but name, performing rituals, commanding labor, and shaping policy. Meanwhile, Pharaoh in the Delta tried to maintain control, but the kingdom became divided, its two centers pulling in different directions. Egypt, once one land under one ruler, became a place of rival authorities, weakening the image of divine unity. Corruption also spread. Tomb workers at Deir el-Medina, once loyal builders of Pharaoh's eternal houses, went on strike, the first recorded labor strike in history. Their wages of grain had not been delivered, their families were hungry, and their patience broke. They laid down their tools and demanded justice. Officials scrambled to respond, but the incident revealed that the system was faltering. If even the builders of tombs for kings lost faith, what hope remained for order? The economy strained further under the cost of defense. Armies had to be maintained, fortresses guarded, fleets built. Egypt was no longer the aggressor, but the defender, and defense is always more expensive. Tribute from conquered lands dwindled as rebellions succeeded, trade routes faltered, and foreign rivals closed in. Pharaoh's coffers, once filled with gold, now ran thin. Taxes on farmers increased, and resentment grew. The people, who had once accepted Pharaoh's divine right as unquestionable, began to see him as another man demanding more than he could give. Leadership itself declined. Not every pharaoh was a Ramesses II or a Thutmose III. Many rulers of the later New Kingdom were weak, short-lived, or distracted. Succession crises broke stability, with brothers, sons, and generals vying for the throne. Each transition drained strength, as rival factions struggled for control. The image of the eternal, unbroken line of divine kingship fractured into a reality of politics, intrigue, and failure. Religion, once Egypt's greatest strength, also became a source of division. The priests of Amun, swollen with wealth, claimed greater authority, while other cults resisted. Pharaohs tried to limit their power, but often failed. The people saw temples richer than villages, priests living in luxury while commoners starved. Faith in Ma'at was not lost, but faith in the men who claimed to guard it grew uncertain. When divine order seemed to serve only the powerful, the poor questioned whether the gods still smiled upon their land. Even the tombs of kings betrayed weakness. Despite hidden valleys and guarded entrances, almost every tomb of the new kingdom was robbed. Treasures meant to guide pharaohs into eternity were stolen by desperate hands, sometimes by the very officials and workers sworn to protect them. If the kings could not protect their own eternal houses, how could they protect the living kingdom? Each looted tomb was a silent sign of decline, a whisper that Egypt's glory was not eternal. Perhaps most dangerous of all was complacency. For centuries, Egypt had believed itself eternal. The Nile would always flood, the sun would always rise, the pharaoh would always reign. This belief bred a kind of arrogance, a slowness to adapt. Rivals developed new weapons, new tactics, new forms of rule, but Egypt clung to its traditions. Its chariots and bronze weapons, once unmatched, grew outdated against iron swords and stronger armies. Its diplomacy, once subtle, seemed rigid in a changing world. Its culture, so deeply rooted in the past, struggled to adjust to the present. By the late New Kingdom, Egypt was a kingdom divided between north and south, drained by enemies and weakened by its own divisions. Pharaohs still built temples, priests still offered prayers, armies still marched, but the vitality was gone. The unity that had once made Egypt the envy of the world now lay fractured, and the faith that had carried it for millennia wavered. Decline from within is often invisible until it is too late. It does not announce itself with a single battle or disaster, but creeps slowly, year by year, tax by tax, famine by famine, weak ruler by weak ruler. By the time Egypt realized its strength was gone, much of it had already slipped away. And yet, even in this decline, Egypt endured. Its people still tilled the soil. Its temples still rose against the desert sky. Its art still captured the beauty of life and death. But the Golden Age was over. The empire that had reached beyond its valley, that had commanded the Near East, that had built monuments for eternity, was now retreating into itself, smaller, weaker, and more vulnerable. The enemies at the gates would not need to press hard. The cracks within had already done much of their work. Egypt had once stood alone, untouched, believing itself eternal. For centuries the deserts had shielded it, the Nile had fed it, and the gods had crowned its kings with divinity. But no land can hold back time, and no empire is safe forever. By the end of the New Kingdom, Egypt was weakened, divided, and vulnerable. It was then that foreign powers, once distant, pressed in, claiming what had been Egypt's own. The land of the pharaohs, once conqueror of others, became the prize of conquerors. The first blow came not from distant empires, but from Egypt's own neighbors. Libyan groups, long present at the western edges of the delta, had slowly migrated into Egyptian land. At first they were mercenaries, hired by pharaohs to fight in their armies. Over time, their chiefs gained wealth, influence, and authority. By the 22nd dynasty, Libyan leaders had become pharaohs themselves, wearing the crowns of Egypt while ruling as outsiders within. Their rule was marked by division. Multiple kings ruling at the same time, north and south split, loyalty fragmented. Egypt was Egyptian in name but foreign in leadership, its unity gone. To the south, Nubia also rose. Once conquered and colonized, Nubians never forgot their strength. They absorbed Egyptian culture, built temples in Egyptian style, and worshipped Egyptian gods. By the 8th century BCE, Nubian kings marched north, conquering Thebes and ruling Egypt as the 25th dynasty. They saw themselves as restorers of Egyptian glory, building temples and honoring Amun. Yet their presence revealed how far Egypt had fallen. The pharaohs were now foreigners, their thrones claimed by those once subject to them. Egypt's pride was wounded, its independence fading. Then came the Assyrians, masters of brutal conquest. With iron weapons, siege machines, and relentless armies, they swept across the Near East. Egypt, fragmented and weakened, could not stand against them. In the 7th century BCE, Assyrian armies invaded, sacking Thebes, looting temples, and leaving ruin. Egypt's once mighty heartland trembled before foreign kings. Though Egyptian rulers regained brief independence afterward, the scar of Assyrian conquest never healed. Not long after, Persia came. Under Cambyses II, the armies of Cyrus the Great's empire marched into Egypt in 525 BCE. They defeated Pharaoh Psamtik III and made Egypt a satrapy, a province of the Persian Empire. Persian kings styled themselves pharaoh, offering sacrifices to Egyptian gods. But the reality was clear. Egypt was no longer master of itself. Its gold, grain, and manpower fed a foreign empire. Its kings were foreign monarchs seated in Persepolis, not native rulers walking the banks of the Nile. For 2 centuries, Egypt endured Persian rule, rising in rebellion at times, but never truly breaking free for long. Then came Alexander the Great. In 332 BCE, the Macedonian conqueror swept through the Persian Empire, and Egypt, weary of Persian rule, welcomed him as a liberator. In Memphis, he was crowned pharaoh, presented as the chosen of Amun. He founded a new city, Alexandria, at the mouth of the Nile, a city that would become one of the greatest centers of learning and trade in the ancient world. Yet Alexander was not Egyptian. His empire stretched far beyond. And after his death, Egypt passed to his general Ptolemy, who founded the Ptolemaic dynasty. The Ptolemies were Greek in origin, but Egyptian in rule. They adopted the crowns, the rituals, and the imagery of pharaohs, presenting themselves as heirs to the ancient tradition. Under their reign, Egypt remained wealthy, its temples active, its culture alive. Alexandria flourished with its library, its lighthouse, its cosmopolitan life. Yet beneath the splendor, tensions simmered. Greek rulers and Egyptian subjects lived side by side, but not as equals. The old unity of identity was gone. Egypt was a jewel in foreign hands, admired but no longer its own. At last came the Romans. In 30 BCE, after the famous drama of Cleopatra VII and Mark Antony, Octavian, later Augustus, took Egypt into Rome's empire. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, ended her life, and with her ended over 3,000 years of Egyptian kingship. Rome claimed Egypt not as an ally, but as a personal possession of the emperor. The Nile's grain fed Rome's people. Its temples honored Roman gods alongside Egyptian ones, and its glory became a part of another empire's story. Foreign rule did not erase Egypt's culture, but it transformed it. Temples continued to rise, hieroglyphs continued to be carved, and Egyptians still prayed to their gods. Yet the authority of Pharaoh was gone, the independence of the kingdom lost. For centuries, Egypt remained under Rome, then Byzantium, and later others. The land of the pharaohs survived, but the empire of the pharaohs was no more. And so, the story of Egypt's decline is not a single fall, but a long surrender. First to Libyans, then Nubians, then Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans. Each wave eroded its independence. Each foreign ruler chipped away at its pride. The Nile still flowed, the temples still stood, the people still lived. But Egypt's soul as master of its own destiny had faded. Yet there is a paradox here. Though Egypt fell politically, it conquered culturally. Its gods, its art, its symbols lived on. Greeks built temples to Isis, Romans worshipped Horus and Anubis, and obelisks from the Nile were carried across the world. Egypt the empire ended, but Egypt the idea lived, carried into the hearts of conquerors and preserved into eternity. The story of Egypt stretches across millennia, filled with pharaohs whose names still echo in stone, monuments that rise against the desert sky, and gods whose faces remain carved into walls. Yet when we think of the final chapter of ancient Egypt, one name shines brighter than all others: Cleopatra VII. She was not the greatest conqueror, nor the most prolific builder, but she became the last symbol of Egyptian independence, the final pharaoh whose life and death mark the end of 3,000 years of rule along the Nile. Cleopatra was born in 69 BCE, a queen in the making, raised in the royal house of the Ptolemies. Her family was Greek in origin, descended from Ptolemy, the general of Alexander the Great, who had taken Egypt centuries before. Yet Cleopatra was unlike her predecessors. Where most Ptolemies clung to Greek customs and ruled as outsiders, Cleopatra embraced Egypt. She learned its language, spoke directly to her people, and presented herself not just as a Greek monarch, but as pharaoh. heir to the traditions of Isis and Hathor. In doing so, she rekindled a bond between ruler and people that had long grown cold. But Egypt in her time was not the empire of old. It was a kingdom in the shadow of Rome, the rising giant of the Mediterranean. Rome's generals and senators saw Egypt as both prize and threat, a land of gold, grain, and ancient prestige. Cleopatra's throne was fragile, surrounded by family intrigue and foreign pressure. Her path to power was not secured by divine right alone, but by cunning, intelligence, and alliances with the men who shaped the fate of Rome. Her first great ally was Julius Caesar. When she was barely 21, she faced exile by her brother and co-ruler Ptolemy III. Desperate, she sought Caesar's aid. In a legendary act of daring, she is said to have been smuggled into his presence rolled in a carpet, emerging to plead her cause. Caesar, impressed by her charm, wit, and ambition, restored her to the throne. Their alliance was sealed not only by politics, but by intimacy. Cleopatra bore Caesar a son, Caesarion, whom she hoped would one day rule both Egypt and Rome. For a brief moment, Egypt seemed again at the center of the world, its queen standing beside the most powerful man alive. But Caesar's death in 44 BCE shattered this dream. Rome plunged into chaos, torn by civil war between Caesar's allies and enemies. Cleopatra, ever the strategist, turned to Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general and one of Rome's new leaders. Together, they formed one of history's most famous partnerships. Antony saw in Cleopatra not only beauty but intelligence and wealth. She saw in him the chance to secure Egypt's survival. Their bond was both political and passionate, filled with feasts, voyages, and promises of empire. In Alexandria, they styled themselves as New Dionysus and Isis, rulers of East and West, a vision of shared power that threatened Rome itself. Their dream, however, collided with the ambitions of Octavian, later Augustus, who sought sole control of Rome. To him, Cleopatra was not a queen but a dangerous rival, a foreign temptress luring Antony away from Rome's duty. Propaganda painted her as a sorceress, a woman of excess and deceit, though in truth she was a shrewd leader fighting for her kingdom's survival. The stage was set for one of history's great confrontations, the war between Octavian and the lovers of Alexandria. The climax came at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. On the waters of Greece, Antony and Cleopatra's fleet faced Octavian's navy. For hours the battle raged, oars thrashing, arrows flying, ships ablaze. At a critical moment, Cleopatra's ships broke through and fled, Antony following her retreat. The battle was lost, and with it, the dream of an independent Egypt. Octavian pursued them to Alexandria, where, a year later, their resistance collapsed. The end was tragic, almost theatrical. Antony, hearing false news that Cleopatra had died, fell upon his sword. Mortally wounded, he was carried to her, dying in her arms. Cleopatra, left to face Octavian's triumph, refused to be paraded in chains through Rome. In August of 33 BCE, she ended her life, according to legend, by the bite of an asp, the sacred Egyptian cobra. With her death, Egypt fell fully under Roman rule. Caesarion was executed, and Octavian took Egypt as his personal province. The line of pharaohs, stretching back 3 millennia, was broken, yet Cleopatra's legacy lived far beyond her life. To her people, she was the last pharaoh, a queen who fought to keep Egypt free. To Rome, she was both fascination and fear, remembered as a woman who challenged the greatest empire of her age. To history, she became legend, a figure of beauty, ambition, tragedy, and resilience. Cleopatra's reign was short compared to the vast sweep of Egyptian history, but her story embodies its final chapter. She stood between worlds, Greek by blood but Egyptian by choice, ancient by tradition, but modern by circumstance. She was both ruler and symbol, the last to wear the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt, the last to claim divinity from Isis, the last to sit upon the throne of the pharaohs. Her fall was Egypt's fall, yet her memory ensured that Egypt was never forgotten. In art, literature, and legend, she became the eternal queen, a reminder that Egypt's spirit lived on, even when its empire was gone. When we speak of the rise and fall of the Egyptians, Cleopatra stands at the closing door, a woman whose life carried the weight of centuries, and whose death marked the end of one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known. Though the last pharaoh lay silent in her tomb, though Rome had claimed the Nile, though the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt were set aside, the story of Egypt did not end. Empires may fall, but their spirit lives on in memory, in culture, in the imprint they leave upon the world. Egypt's legacy is unlike any other, for even after 3,000 years of rise and fall, its shadow stretches across the ages, touching lives far beyond its deserts. The first and most visible legacy is in its monuments. The pyramids at Giza, the temples at Karnak and Luxor, the tombs of the Valley of the Kings. These stand as eternal witnesses, built for pharaohs, gods, and eternity. They continue to awe humanity thousands of years later. No other civilization left such enduring symbols of faith and ambition. Travelers from Greece, Rome, and beyond marveled at them, writing of their wonder. Even today, millions cross oceans to stand before them, to feel the weight of stone, to see the sunrise light strike faces carved before Abraham or Moses walked the earth. The builders achieved their goal, to be remembered forever. But Egypt's legacy is not only stone, it is knowledge. The Egyptians invented writing systems, hieroglyphs, hieratic, demotic, and developed papyrus scrolls that carried ideas through centuries. They pioneered mathematics, measuring land after floods, calculating architecture, and mapping the stars. They advanced medicine, setting bones, performing surgeries, and prescribing remedies of herbs and honey. Greek physicians later studied their works, and through them, Egyptian wisdom flowed into Western science. In astronomy, engineering, and even simple calendar making, Egypt's precision guided farmers, priests, and kings for generations. Religion, too, carries Egypt's mark. The idea of life after death, of judgment, of a paradise beyond, spread far beyond the Nile. The weighing of the heart, the promise of the field of reeds, the belief that moral living shapes eternal destiny. These echoes can be traced in later cultures and faiths. Egyptian gods traveled with traders and conquerors, worshipped in temples as far as Rome. Isis, in particular, became a goddess of the Mediterranean world, beloved even when her homeland's temples fell. Egypt's spiritual imagination shaped how humanity saw the soul and eternity. Egypt's art and style also endure. The grace of its statues, the symmetry of its temples, the brilliance of its colors, all inspired later artists. From Greek sculptures to Renaissance painters, Egypt's forms influenced design. Obelisks still rise in cities across the world, from Paris to Washington, silent reminders of a land that carved permanence from stone. Jewelry, architecture, and even fashion echo motifs that began on the banks of the Nile. In politics, Egypt left another legacy, the idea of divine kingship. The pharaoh as god-king influenced rulers from Persia to Rome, from medieval monarchs to modern visions of absolute power. The concept that a ruler embodied the will of heaven, that his authority was sacred, found roots in Egypt's long reign. Though empires rose and fell after it, many borrowed from Egypt's model of centralized, God-sanctioned rule. And yet, Egypt's legacy is not only in grandeur, but also in resilience. Few civilizations endured so long, adapting through famine, invasion, and change. Egypt showed that continuity is as powerful as conquest, that culture can outlast kingdoms, that faith can hold people together through centuries of upheaval. Its survival taught the world that civilization is not only measured in victories, but in endurance. Even in decline, Egypt's memory inspired others. To the Greeks, Egypt was a land of wisdom, its priests keepers of secret knowledge. To the Romans, it was exotic and eternal, a place of mystery and wealth. To medieval travelers, it was a wonder, its monuments a puzzle. To modern archaeologists, it became a treasure trove of history, revealing through mummies, papyri, and carvings the voices of the past. No other ancient land has captured imagination so completely, across so many ages. And for Egyptians themselves, the legacy endured. Though the empire of pharaohs ended, the people remained, living by the Nile, farming its soil, praying to God in new forms. Islam would later reshape Egypt's identity, but even then, the memory of the pharaohs lingered, carved into stone, whispered in tales, a heritage woven into the nation's soul. Egyptians today still live in the shadow of pyramids, still look upon the same river, still walk among the ruins of their ancestors. The past is not dead, it breathes in the present. The greatest measure of Egypt's legacy may be this. When we think of ancient history, the first image that rises is Egypt, the pyramids, the Sphinx, the golden mask of Tutankhamun. These are not merely artifacts, but symbols of civilization itself. Egypt became the face of antiquity, the proof that humanity can build beauty, wisdom, and meaning that last for eternity. Empires rose and fell after Egypt. Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome all had their glory. But none lasted as long. None left such marks of permanence. None captured the imagination of the world with such power. Egypt's story is unique, its legacy eternal. So when we speak of the rise and fall of the Egyptians, we are not speaking of something lost. We are speaking of something that still lives. In stone, in memory, in influence, Egypt remains. The pharaohs are gone, their crowns buried, their temples weathered. But their dream of eternity succeeded. For as long as humanity remembers, Egypt has never truly fallen. History is written in what happened, but it is often haunted by the question of what might have been. Egypt, with its 3,000 years of continuity, its wealth of monuments, its knowledge of gods and stars, seems almost eternal. Yet like all empires, it fell. Still, one cannot help but ask, what if it had survived? What if the Nile kingdom had adapted faster, ruled wiser, resisted harder, and endured into the modern world as an empire, not just as a memory? Imagine first the politics. Had Egypt's later pharaohs held unity, keeping priests and generals in check, the kingdom might have resisted foreign rule. If the gold of Nubia had been guarded more carefully, if the delta had not fractured into rival domains, Pharaoh could have maintained power strong enough to withstand Libyan and Assyrian pressure. With reforms, Egypt might have entered the Iron Age not as a laggard, but as a leader, adopting new weapons and strategies, keeping pace with neighbors instead of falling behind. Its borders might have held firm, and the title of Pharaoh might have continued, unbroken, into the age of Alexander and beyond. Economically, Egypt's survival could have transformed the Mediterranean. Its grain already fed empires from the Levant to Rome. Had Egypt remained independent, it might have dominated regional trade, using its ports on the Red Sea to link Africa, Arabia, and India. Alexandria could have risen not under Greek rule, but under native pharaohs, becoming a hub of Egyptian science and commerce centuries earlier. Instead of being a province of Rome, Egypt could have been Rome's rival, an Eastern superpower balancing the Mediterranean world. Culturally, the impact would be staggering. Egyptian art, religion, and philosophy would not have been preserved as relics, but continued as living traditions. Imagine temples still active, priests still guiding festivals, pharaohs still commissioning monuments in the classical age. Instead of Greek gods overshadowing them, Isis and Osiris might have spread further, shaping spiritual life across Europe and Asia. The idea of divine kingship, already influential, might have taken root even more deeply in later monarchies, reshaping the course of governance across continents. Science, too, would have advanced differently. Egypt's knowledge of medicine, astronomy, and engineering was profound. Had it been nurtured, instead of absorbed piecemeal into Greek and Roman systems, Egypt might have pioneered new discoveries earlier. Papyrus scrolls, copied and expanded, could have formed libraries rivaling anything in Greece or Rome. The lost potential of Egyptian thought is one of history's great mysteries. A living Egypt might have bridged Africa and the Mediterranean as a center of innovation. And what of religion? If Egypt had endured, the vision of eternity it offered, the weighing of the heart, the field of reeds, the balance of Mayat, might have continued as a dominant belief. Other faiths would still have risen, but Egyptian ideas might have blended more strongly into them, altering the course of spiritual history. The gods of the Nile, carried into new lands by trade and conquest, might have shaped the symbols and rituals of later civilizations far more deeply than they already did. Of course, survival would have brought challenges. An eternal Egypt would have needed reform, letting go of some traditions to keep others alive. Pharaohs would have had to share power more wisely, adapt military systems, encourage new technology, and resist the weight of complacency. They would have had to see change not as threat, but as strength. In truth, this was where Egypt often faltered. Its devotion to tradition became both its glory and its weakness. Without adaptation, survival would always be temporary. Yet imagining an unbroken Egypt is to imagine a world where the most ancient of civilizations stood shoulder to shoulder with Rome, Byzantium, the caliphates, and modern nations. It might have been Africa's greatest continuous power, shaping the continent not only with monuments but with policy, science, and trade. Perhaps its borders would have stretched across deserts and seas, making the Nile Valley the heart of a global empire. But perhaps the greater truth is this. In a way, Egypt did survive. Not politically, not with pharaohs on the throne, but in memory, culture, and influence. Even conquerors could not erase it. The Greeks called on Isis, the Romans raised obelisks, medieval scholars puzzled over its wisdom, and modern nations still marvel at its ruins. Egypt endures not as empire, but as idea, not as state, but as symbol. Its survival is in the fact that when we speak of the ancient world, Egypt comes first to mind. The question, what if Egypt had survived, is, in the end, a mirror. It shows us not only what might have been, but what truly mattered, that survival of the body is not the only survival. Egypt's empire died, but its spirit achieved the eternity its builders sought. Perhaps that is the greatest survival of all. No empire rises by accident, and no empire falls without cause. Egypt's history, stretching across millennia, is shaped by the hands of its rulers. Some pharaohs lifted their people to heights of power and prosperity, while others, through vanity, weakness, or misjudgment, brought decline. To understand the story of Egypt is to see both sides. The great leaders whose vision built glory, and the great mistakes that undermined it. Among the greatest was Djoser of the Old Kingdom. Under his reign, guided by his architect Imhotep, Egypt saw the building of the Step Pyramid at Saqqara, the first monumental stone structure in history. It was more than a tomb. It was a statement that Egypt had entered an age of innovation, discipline, and divine ambition. Djoser and Imhotep showed that Pharaoh's power could shape stone and time, laying the foundation for centuries of architectural wonders. Then came Sneferu, the king of experiments, whose pyramids at Meidum bent, and Red Pyramid perfected the art of pyramid building. His willingness to try, to fail, and to try again created the model that culminated in the Great Pyramid of Khufu. Khufu himself, though remembered with mixed feelings by his people, left behind the most iconic symbol of Egypt. His successors, Khafra and Menkaura, added their own monuments, creating the Giza Plateau that still astonishes the world. These early kings were visionaries, uniting resources, labor, and belief into works of eternity. In the Middle Kingdom, Mentuhotep II restored unity after chaos, proving that leadership could heal a broken land. Senusret III expanded Egypt's borders and reformed governance, remembered for his stern face carved in stone, a ruler who bore the burden of kingship with gravity. They showed resilience after collapse, teaching that greatness was not only in rising, but in rising again after falling. The new kingdom brought figures of immense stature. Hatshepsut ruled with grace and ambition, opening trade, building monumental temples, and proving that leadership was not limited by gender. Thutmose III expanded Egypt's empire to its widest reach, a strategist whose campaigns made Egypt a superpower. Amenhotep III presided over an age of wealth and art, leaving behind magnificent temples and statues. Ramesses II, remembered as the Great, embodied the image of Pharaoh as warrior and builder, filling Egypt with monuments and making his name echo through centuries. Yet alongside greatness came mistakes. Akhenaten's religious revolution, though bold, destabilized Egypt. By attempting to replace the worship of Amun and the old gods with Aten alone, he fractured traditions that bound the people together. His neglect of diplomacy and military affairs left Egypt vulnerable, and though his vision of monotheism fascinates us today, in his time it weakened the kingdom. His reign is a reminder that even inspired leaders can bring ruin if they ignore the realities of power. Ramesses II, for all his grandeur, also revealed the danger of excess. His temples and statues proclaimed glory, but his endless building drained resources. The Battle of Kadesh, carved as a great victory, was in truth a stalemate, showing the limits of his power. His long reign left stability, but also debts and pressures that his successors could not bear. His greatness was undeniable, but his ambition was costly. Later, pharaohs often lacked the strength or vision of their ancestors. Some reigned briefly, consumed by palace intrigues. Others clung to the image of divinity while losing grip on reality. They allowed priests of Amun to grow too powerful, generals to act independently, and foreign powers to exploit Egypt's divisions. Weak leadership turned cracks into fractures, until the empire's unity could no longer be restored. The greatest mistake of Egypt's rulers was perhaps their devotion to tradition at the expense of adaptation. For centuries, the system had worked. Pharaoh as god, Ma'at as order, temples as centers of power. But when the world changed, when iron weapons replaced bronze, when foreign powers developed new strategies, Egypt often failed to change with it. Its glory lay in permanence, but permanence became rigidity, and rigidity became weakness. Still, even in mistakes, Egypt left lessons. Strong leadership can unite a people, but unchecked ambition can exhaust them. Innovation can lift an empire, but ignoring change can destroy it. Faith can sustain a nation, but when faith is manipulated for power, it corrodes trust. Egypt's long story reveals the double edge of greatness. The same qualities that build an empire can, if misused, bring it down. When we look at Egypt's leaders, we see not only gods in stone, but humans in history. Their choices, their triumphs, their errors shaped one of the greatest civilizations ever known. Some left legacies of glory, others of warning. Together, they remind us that leadership is fragile, that empires rise and fall not only by fate, but by the wisdom or folly of those who rule.